Hello and welcome to the last video of this semester. I am still Robert Steinbauer, and today we talk about international business, sweatshops and child labor. Let's make sure we are on the same page when we talk about globalization. Globalization simply means that a company opens subsidiaries in another or multiple countries and becomes a multinational corporation, a MNC. While having international subsidiaries grants access to new markets, cheaper resources and cheaper production, international subsidiaries also raise a lot of ethical questions. For example, should organizations charge different prices in different countries for the same product? How much should it pay its employees if they do the exact same work in a different country? What environmental standards should the company follow? Should the organization follow its own moral code, or should it adapt to the norms and customs of the host country? When asked to pay bribes or engage in other illegal or immoral activities, what should the company do? And how can the organization manage conflict between cultures that don't agree on what is considered moral or immoral? So organizations face many problems when expanding their footprint. Instead of addressing each challenge individually, Velasquez discusses whether contemporary ethics, so the ethical theories that we learn in this class, can provide a framework to solve issues related to globalization. As you probably can guess from the title of this manuscript, he's not very optimistic though, and argues that contemporary ethics has failed the multinational manager. And in his words, he said, contemporary ethics, I want to argue, can offer no moral principles that are at least theoretically capable of arbitrating the moral differences that arise in the cross-cultural context that globalization has forced business managers to enter. The author then reviews and critiques several ethical theories. So let's see what Velasquez has to say. The first ethical theory discussed is called ethical relativism. Since I have not talked about it at all, I will briefly review it. Ethical relativism argues that there are no universally valid moral standards that can be justified as appropriate for evaluating the behaviors of people in all cultures. Each culture and even each social group has its own moral traditions and values, and people outside this social group should not judge them. You may still remember our lecture on ethical theories. I had a slide that explained what affects your perception of right and wrong. It listed religion, geography, nationality, culture, community, family, at the highest level labeled the human experience. And I also said something along the lines to, while many individuals share similar experiences, in the end, every person has been affected by the environment differently and may arrive at unique conclusions. When people from different cultures disagree on what is ethical or unethical, who decides who is right or wrong? Well, ethical relativism argues that nobody's wrong and everybody's right. So if you are raised by the Russian mafia and think that it's okay to start your day with a bottle of cheap vodka before collecting some money from the local community to protect them from yourself, well, then you should do that. And different cultures should not judge you if this is seen appropriate by your society or by your social group. When ethical dilemmas arise within a social group, the members must rely on the traditions and values established by their own group. Honestly, that sounds like a rather poor ethical theory, wouldn't you agree? However, to properly understand ethical relativism, we have to realize that it was developed in ancient Greek, at times when globalization was not happening on a scale like we see today. When people were not exposed to many different cultures, but just encountered them one at a time. Over 2,000 years ago, Greek philosophers observed that different cultures adapted different norms, values, and beliefs, and that even their own norms, values, and beliefs changed over time. As a result, people's moral decision-making, so their awareness, judgment, intentions, and behavior, are based on their experiences within their own culture. But most importantly, the Greek philosophers were unable to explain why their own moral beliefs should be the ones that are universally accepted, and were further not able to develop formal or universal criteria to judge different world views. So, ethical relativism simply acknowledges that we have to respect different opinions, that you have to respect different cultures. But it does not say that you should take advantage of other cultures, nor does it provide any guidance on how to overcome conflict when different cultures disagree. Unfortunately, in the 1970s and 80s, when globalization was on the rise, organizations and executives used ethical relativism to rationalize the way they acted when outsourcing production to developing countries. They argued that if a developing country does not have any environmental standards, then a foreign company who sets up a subsidiary can take advantage of this and clearly violate home country standards and pollute the environment as much as the developing country allows it. If a developing country does not have a minimum wage or any health and safety standards, then I guess it's okay to expose workers to inhumane or hazardous working conditions while barely paying them enough to survive. Organizations can suddenly rationalize the use of child or even bonded labor, or engage in corruption or bribery because others are doing it, and who are they to judge them? Again, the theory states that we should not judge different cultures. That is correct. We need to accept their norms and rituals. The theory, however, does not say you should abuse them or treat them as a means to your own end. But even if applied properly, ethical relativism is very difficult, if not impossible to use. What should a manager do if employees from different cultures have a conflict? Based on the theory, both employees are right, yet they still don't agree with each other. By themselves, the values of one particular culture are no more or less justified than conflicting values of another culture. Imagine an argument between a Buddhist monk and the sad Russian mafia member. Velasquez has a very valid point that while it is important to understand and respect your own and others' cultural norms, you should not simply accept them, especially if they violate your personal moral standards. Just because others are doing it does not necessarily make it ethical. Since ethical relativism is obviously not the answer, Velasquez went on to analyze absolutism, which is a different approach to ethical theories. Absolutism argues that there are universally valid moral standards that can be used to legitimately assess decisions and actions in all cultures. While people may not follow these standards, they still recognize them as valid if justified. The human rights approach, justice principle, and utilitarianism are listed as examples of absolutism. Since we have discussed them already in this class, remember when I talked about deontology and utilitarianism, I will not review them but only briefly summarize why they fail to provide satisfying answers in a global work environment. Velasquez's main argument rests on the fact that all these theories are based on an individualistic concept of humans that is simply not shared by all cultures. In many collectivistic cultures, the goals and welfare of the community are more important than the goals and welfare of the individual. One of the fundamental principles of deontology is fair treatment of individuals, but collectivistic cultures tend to see fair treatment when everybody receives equal shares, while individualistic cultures see fair treatment when each individual receives his or her fair share based on his or her contribution. Even the human rights approach that is supposed to be universal may be difficult to implement in hierarchical cultures. For example, the Indian caste system assumes that people on top are not equal to the people on the bottom. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights specifically states in the first article that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Finally, while utilitarianism seeks to maximize the welfare for all, John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham were very clear that everybody to be counted as one, nobody for more than one. An individual is an individual, regardless of his or her status in society. Again, this focus on the individual violates several assumptions in collectivistic and hierarchical cultures. Velasquez does not talk much about virtue ethics, but considering that it is an egocentric approach that focuses on how to foster your own virtues, which of course are influenced by your culture, it seems that Velasquez does not think that virtue ethics is able to solve the conflict between cultures either. So, is that it? Is there nothing we can do? While each ethical theory on its own might not be helpful, citing Donaldson and Dunphy, Velasquez provides some insight about how we can find useful elements from relativism and absolutism to potentially create an ethical theory that can be successfully applied in the context of globalization. Specifically, Donaldson and Dunphy argue that most cultures share hypernorms that represent basic values such as respectfulness, honesty, trust, integrity, sincerity, loyalty, and diligence. However, the way these hypernorms are operationalized is different from country to country or from subculture to subculture. For example, being respectful might mean to show up to a business meeting 10 minutes early or 30 minutes late, depending on whether your meeting is in Germany, Japan, Mexico, or Nigeria. So managers need to be aware how the primary values, the hyper values, are expressed in a particular culture. Understanding the distinction between hypernorms and related behavior helps people in business to understand cultural differences and to develop cultural sensitivity and imagination. Once the basic rules are defined, meaning the hypernorms are operationalized in a way that all group members can agree upon, ethical relativism can fill in the moral free space, meaning that local norms and rituals will be followed unless they violate any absolute hypernorms. Even though Velasquez goes on to criticize this mixed method approach, he does not provide a better solution either. In addition, his counter-argument that hypernorms will likely be based on human rights and some cultures disagree on equal treatment of humans is rather weak. For example, all members of the United Nations have at least ratified one of the 9 core international human rights treaties, and 80% have ratified 4 or more, demonstrating that the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights is universal. Also, don't forget that this article was published over 20 years ago and that access to the internet and virtual education contribute to an equal rights movement, even in hierarchical cultures. It is my understanding that India's constitution now requires a certain number of government jobs and places in higher education to be reserved for the lower strata of the caste system. So the government is actively working on creating a level playing field for all its citizens. Even though it may take some time until all citizens will be treated equally. If organizations who operate in these countries communicate and explain their expectations clearly to all employees, this mixed approach seems to be able to resolve many, if not most, problems managers of multinational corporations face when dealing with issues related to globalization, especially if the organization has ethical leaders and an ethical organizational culture.